we are good to go.
It sounded like it to me. 414. First and fourth. 414. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere he leads me in this world below. Anywhere without him dearest joys would fade. Anywhere with Jesus I am not afraid. Anywhere, fear I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere with Jesus I can go to sleep. When the darkening shadows round about me creep, knowing I shall waken nevermore to roam. Anywhere with Jesus will be home, sweet home. Anywhere, fear I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. 549. There is sunshine in my soul today, more glorious and bright than glows in any earthly sky. For Jesus is my light. Oh, there's sunshine, blessed sunshine, while the peaceful, happy moments roll. When Jesus shows his smiling face, there is sunshine in my soul. There is music in my soul today, a carol to my King. And Jesus, listening, can hear the songs I cannot sing. Oh, there's sunshine, blessed sunshine, while the peaceful, happy moments roll. When Jesus shows his smiling face, there is sunshine in my soul. There is gladness in my soul today, and hope and praise and love for blessings which he gives me now, for joys laid up above. Oh, there's sunshine, blessed sunshine, while the peaceful, happy moments roll. When Jesus shows his smiling face, there is sunshine in my soul.
All right. This one appears to be working as well. I'll be honest with you, I'm still trying to get back into a groove after the spiritual retreat. I imagine you are as well. So if I'm a little discombobulated tonight, that is why. So, but let's go over to Matthew chapter 20. We're continuing our study on these questions of Jesus that we've been looking at. And we're getting closer to the end of these questions. We're not quite there yet, but we are getting closer to the end of Matthew's gospel, looking at these questions. Now, chapter 20 is different from Matthew 19, because we were looking at Matthew 19. Obviously, we're here now in Matthew 20. And Matthew 20 begins a new section of Jesus' teachings where he's teaching about the kingdom of heaven. And that begins with Jesus giving a parable in verses 1 through 16 where he compares the kingdom of heaven in verse 1 to a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. And that parable ends in verse 16 with Jesus making the point that in the kingdom of heaven the last shall be first and the first shall be last. It's really a lesson about humility in God's heavenly kingdom. Now, following that, in verses 17 through 19, Matthew records Jesus as taking the apostles aside, and he's informing them about what was going to happen in Jerusalem, where it would be that Jesus would suffer to the point of being crucified, but later resurrected on the third day. So Jesus has taken his apostles aside. We're assuming they're by themselves, but there are other people close to the apostles that are with them. Among them, as verse 20 indicates, is the mother of the sons of Zebedee. Now we'll talk about her in just a moment, but verse 20 says, the mother of the sons of Zebedee came to Jesus with her sons, bowing down, making a request of him. Now, as we see in the text, in this verse, Matthew is recording that after Jesus gave the teachings of verses 1 through 19 of this chapter, this mother of the sons of Zebedee approached Jesus. She bowed down and began to make a request of Jesus. Now, the first question I want to ask here is, who are the sons of Zebedee? Can anyone tell? James and John. The apostles, James and John. Now, why are James and John important? What was their relationship to Jesus besides being just apostles? Okay, he was close to John and to James. And who's the third one that he was close to? Peter. Okay. So James, John, and Peter were in that inner circle. He had the 12 apostles, but James, John, and Peter were in the inner circle of Jesus' apostle. So it's James and John's mother, along with her sons, James and John, that come to Jesus. So we have to also just ask at least briefly who their mother was. We don't know a lot about their mother, except for a few choice scriptures. One of those is Mark 16, verse 1. That if this is the same woman, her name is Salome, and she was among the women who first arrived at the tomb of Jesus on the morning of his resurrection. And so it's their mother that comes to Jesus with this request along with her sons. But she bows down. What does that indicate? Respect. She's coming to Jesus in a very respectful manner with this request that we'll look at in a moment, with this request that she is about to make. Anything else on verse 20? Okay. So verse 20 is what I like to call one of those stage-setting verses about this request she makes. And this verse 20 introduces for us what we're going to examine today in verses 21 through 23. where in response to this request that Salome, the mother of the sons of Zebedee, Jesus asked the question we find in verse 23. In order to help both Salome as well as the apostles James and John come to an awareness of what they are truly asking when they make that request that we'll read about in verse 21 of this chapter. Now, in verses 21 through 23, there are two questions of Jesus, but the one we're going to focus on is the one found in verse 23. And we'll talk about it when we get there. But there are 2 points about why Jesus asked the question that he does that we find in verses 21 through 23. The first point we'll examine from verses 21 and 22 is that Jesus asked this question because of the wish or the request that the mother of James and John makes. And the second point we'll examine from verse 23 is that Jesus asked this question because he knew that James and John would drink of his cup. Now, after looking at these things, what we will learn is that we must learn something from Jesus' questions. There's something to be learned about this question that we're going to look at and all the questions we will have examined by the end of this series of classes. Well, if there's nothing else on verse 20, we'll read through verses 21 through 23, and then we'll look at these points. Again, this is Matthew chapter 20, beginning in verse 21. We read, "And he said to her, 'What do you wish?' She said to him, 'Command that in your kingdom these 2 sons of mine may sit on your right hand, one on your right and one on your left.' But Jesus answered, 'You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I am about to drink?' They said to him, 'We are able.' He said to them, 'My cup you shall drink, but to sit on my right and on my left, this is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father.'" All right. So we're exploring this question of Jesus that, again, we don't arrive at until verse 23, or 22, sorry. I said 23, but I meant 22. So we're asking the question, why did he ask this question? Point number 1, because of the wish that this woman made. So now at verse 21, we arrive at the first of 2 questions that we see. What's the first question Jesus asked in response to this request that she's about to make? Okay, but it's the question we're looking at. First he asked, "What do you wish?" A pretty simple question. We don't need to spend a lot of time with that. So he wants to know, well, what do you want? So what's the request she makes? Okay, her son said, "On one on the right, one on the left," in Jesus' kingdom. So what is she asking? One on the right, one on the left. Can anyone tell me what's significant about that? Okay. It's a pretty important position. They're positions of honor. They're positions of authority. Honor and power. That's a good way to put it. So she's asking Jesus, in your kingdom, my 2 sons will sit in these on either side of you, in these positions of power. So she's making this request. But again, this is in that context of the kingdom of heaven. Now, just by way of review, in the Jewish mindset, what kind of kingdom does she have in mind? An earthly one. All through this, in Jesus' dealings with the apostles and the crowds at large, they had in mind this earthly kingdom. The Messiah was going to come in, kick the Romans out of power, and set up this earthly kingdom. That's the mindset that Salome, the mother of James and John, is operating from. So the idea in her question is like, Jesus, when you bring your kingdom in, I want my 2 sons to sit alongside you in those positions of power. questions or comments on verse 21? Right. Exactly. They did not understand what Jesus' true purpose was, as Andrew put it. Exactly. Now, this is where the context of the chapter becomes important. Now, at the end of the parable Jesus gave in the first 16 chapters, or verses, not chapters, verses of this chapter, the last point he made at the end of that parable in verse 16 was, so the last shall be first and the first last. Now, what the mother of James and John is asking for is for her sons to be first, not last. Again, operating from this mindset that the kingdom of Jesus was going to be earthly. But again, right. Right, it has not clicked. And it won't click till much later. Even when you read Acts chapter 1, Jesus is going back to heaven, and they ask, is it now that you're going to restore the kingdom? Even after his resurrection and ascension, they're still thinking earthly kingdom. But that's a different study in Acts chapter 1. But again, the context of this chapter is still the kingdom of heaven. That's how these are terms Jesus uses, the kingdom of God, kingdom of heaven, to emphasize that point that his kingdom that he's bringing in, it's not earthly. It's spiritual. It's heavenly. It's from God. It's not a physical kingdom. That's a good way to put it, an upside-down kingdom. Right. It's not about the power. And that's part of what Jesus is going to get at when he responds to this request that this woman is making. Anything else on verse 21? All right. So verse 22, Jesus goes on to answer, and this is where we're going to run into his question that we're examining. But first he says, before he asks the question, what does he say? In verse 22. You don't know what you're asking. Now, when someone asks a question and we respond, you don't know what you're asking, what's the point of that statement? That's the idea. More than you bargained for. Realize what you're asking. You're not fully aware of what you're asking. And then he asks this question. Are you able to drink the cup that I am about to drink? Now, at this point, when he asks this question, Jesus is now shifting his attention from the mother of James and John to now James and John themselves. Now, one reason we know that is because the word you in this question, it's actually in the plural. It's not you, just you. It's you, both of you in this case. I think that sound is something coming from... Oh, it's your thing? I just know that thing back in the old kitchen was also making a similar sound. So, but this is the central question of this section. Jesus asks, are you able to drink the cup? Now, when we think of a cup, what is that? Or actually, let me ask a different question. That's not a good question. I apologize. when you're drinking out of a cup, what are you doing? You're drinking a beverage, but what else is involved with drinking that beverage? Okay, let's try to think bigger than just the obvious physical things going. What's that, Don? You're emptying the cup, but you're experiencing it. Jesus uses this image of a cup and making the point, are you able to endure what I'm going to endure? What's he pointing toward? His death. Now, there are two reasons we know that. Number one, from the chapter, verses 17 through 19, he's reminded them about what he's going to endure in the crucifixion, followed by the resurrection. But a second reason we know he's talking about his death is because we find this same imagery in Matthew 26, verse 39. Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's praying. And one thing he says is, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Now, bringing that here into Matthew 20, what's he asking when he says, are you able to drink the cup that I am about to drink? What do you mean by bear the weight, Shanna? That's possible. That's part of it. Okay. That's exactly what it's talking about. The agony, the pain. Are you able to endure that? Now, Jesus is going to suffer on the cross. But as we'll see in just a moment, he's not asking them, are you able to be crucified? That's not his point. His point is about, are you able to endure the suffering that Jesus was about to suffer on his way to the cross and on the cross itself? But again, we have to remember, James, John, their mother, they don't realize that's what Jesus is talking about. They're still thinking he's going to bring in the kingdom, the earthly kingdom. So when they hear Jesus' words, they hear him asking something more about him becoming king rather than him going on to suffer on the cross. Again, as Andrea put it, the cross hasn't really clicked with them, even though Jesus has been very clear about it just moments before this. And so Jesus asked this question. How do James and John respond? Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, this cup imagery, we find it all across the scriptures. But in one of those cases, that was Isaiah 51, what? 17. Right. So this cup imagery is pretty common. And it's imagery Jesus' audience would be familiar with. So, yeah, exactly. So again, Jesus asked this question. How do James and John respond? Yes, we can. You able to drink the cup that I'm about to drink, James and John? Yes, we can. We are able. And again, they respond that way because they're still thinking physical kingdom. I can be a part of bringing about that physical kingdom. But again, we know that's not what Jesus is talking about. But Jesus is helping them get there. And we'll see that more clearly when we reach verse 23. So they say, yes, we are able. We're able to go through whatever you need to go through to get to that kingdom. Questions or comments on verse 22? In verse 22 of Matthew 20? Okay, can you read Matthew 20:22 in your guys', one of you, Shannon? What version are you reading? New King James. I am not sure why the King James added that in there. I would have to go back and research that. I'm sorry don't have an answer for you for that, Shannon. Why the it's the same idea. I mean, because, we know what baptism is. But if that question was there, attached to this one that we're looking at, if the baptism idea was inserted, it's the idea that it would be a full experience of it. This story is, okay, there I am. Mark chapter 10 would have it, and I'm trying to stay in Matthew, but it's Mark 10, verses 35 through 45 is what my header says. You can also find it. Yeah, Mark 10:38 has it. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? That might be why the New King James included it in Matthew. But that's a good observation and good question to ask, Shannon. So, but as we know, the gospel writers record the same stories, but they're not identical to each other. But it's still the same idea that, are you able to experience what I'm about to experience? Now, and so that's what this idea of drinking the cup is about. It's about experience. Now, this isn't a cup, but I'm going to use it because I have it. Everybody knows I love this. Dr. Pepper. And Sammy, thank you for providing this illustration for us tonight, because you got this for me. When I drink a Dr. Pepper, I'm experiencing it. That's what this drinking the cup idea is about. Is that Jesus, he's not only going to the cross, he's not only going to suffer, he's going to experience it all. And that's where the baptism idea goes in, if we read it with that. Immersed in it. Exactly. And that's what happens when we're baptized in the water. We're immersed. But that baptism language, it's not just in reference to what happens in the water. We find it as an image of other things that the people of God experience. You have the baptism of the Holy Spirit idea that Jesus brings out earlier. I don't remember if that's in Matthew or another gospel. But anyway, that's kind of the long answer to your question. Does it help you, Shannon? Okay. Anything else on verse 22? Okay. So putting verses 21 and 22 together, the point we should see from these verses about why Jesus asked this question is that Jesus asked this question because of the wish of the mother of James and John. Now in these verses, Matthew has shown that Jesus' question that he asked in verse 22 arises in response to what the mother of James and John was wishing for, which was for her sons to sit in positions of authority alongside Jesus. Now, Matthew is also shown in these verses is that Jesus' question arises from the fact that James and John did not realize what they were asking in making the request they were making with their mother. As a result, James and John say, we're able to drink that cup that we're about to drink. But they didn't realize that what Jesus was asking about was with whether or not they were able to endure the suffering that Jesus was going to suffer on the cross. And they probably did when they came to that realization of what Jesus was really talking about. Anything else on 22 or 21? Okay. So verse 23, Jesus asked this question because he knew James and John would drink of his cup. Again, we're going to break this verse down. In the first part of verse 23, what does Jesus say? And say that again, Shanna. You will indeed drink my cup, or the New American Standard has my cup you shall drink. Now, based on what we've already talked about, what is he saying? They will also suffer persecution. They will suffer. But again, James and John aren't hearing that. They're still thinking this has something to do with his kingdom. But what Jesus is saying, you are going to suffer. But he doesn't stop there. What else does he say? It's not up to him who will sit on his right and his left hand. And then he adds, this is not mine to give. Now, what Jesus says in the second part of the verse will function to introduce what he will go on to say in the last part of the verse. But this is where he's helping them, James and John, to realize that that's not what they should be concerned with. They should not be concerned with their position in the kingdom, because it is not Jesus' authority to make those kinds of decisions when it comes to the kingdom. Now, with that in mind, something else we should understand from this part of the verse is that what Jesus says here does not mean that James and John would not be a part of Jesus' kingdom. Rather, it means that it is not Jesus who decides what position they will occupy in the kingdom. Now, it is for this reason that in the last part of the verse, Jesus concludes by saying, "But it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father." So who's in charge of the kingdom? God. More specifically, God the Father. Now, in this last part of verse 23, Jesus is concluding his answer to the request of verse 21 by saying that it is God the Father who decides what position the followers of Jesus would occupy in the kingdom. Well, what we should also notice from Jesus' response here is that he does not give any indication as to whether or not God the Father will even allow anyone to sit in positions of authority alongside Jesus. He doesn't really address that point. Instead, Jesus' point here is simply that it is God who decides what positions followers of Jesus will occupy in the kingdom. Now, in addition to this, something else we should notice from this verse is that Matthew does not record how James, John, and their mother respond to Jesus' words here. There's no response from them recorded. Instead, if we were to jump to verse 24, all we see is that the other 10 apostles got pretty angry about this conversation taking place in the first place. But we don't see a response from James, John, and their mother. Matthew doesn't record that here. Well, why? Because that's not his point. His point is all about how Jesus deals with this request. Questions or comments on verse 23? So the point we should see from verse 23 about why Jesus asked his question is that Jesus asked his question because he knew that James and John would drink of his cup. Now in this verse, Matthew has shown that Jesus had a knowledge of the fact that James and John would drink of his cup. What kind of cup was it again? The suffering. The cup of his suffering. He's already told them, you will drink of the cup. Right. Right. That's what I'm about to address. So, Andrea's taking us in the right direction. Now again, the suffering James and John would endure wouldn't be crucifixion. We know from history that they weren't crucified. So, James, Acts chapter 12, verse 2. He's executed by the sword, is what Acts 12, verse 2. Now, John, as far as Scripture is concerned, he suffered in a variety of ways. In Acts, and I don't have the specific passages in front of me, but in Acts we read that he suffered by being imprisoned, he was scourged, his life was endangered, and then you jump over to Revelation. What's happening in Revelation? Where is he? Patmos. He was exiled. Revelation chapter 1, verse 9. That island? I think it's off the coast of Italy, if I'm not, but maybe not. But then we ask, well, how did John die? Tradition says that John is the only apostle to have died at an old age. He didn't die as a martyr. He went on to live a fairly peaceful life after everything we read in the scriptures. But the fact remains the same. He did drink of Jesus' cup. He suffered for his service to Jesus. And James, well again, Acts chapter 12, verse 2. He suffered and he died as a martyr. Questions or comments on verse 23? All right. So when we consider everything that Matthew has recorded in verses 20 through 23 of this chapter, the point we should be left with is that Jesus had reasons for asking the question that he did. He asked because of the wish of the mother and James and John, because of the wish of the mother of James and John. And he asked this question because he knew that James and John would drink of his cup. Now, with that being the case, what we should learn from this section is that we have a responsibility to learn from Jesus' questions. Now, in asking this question that he did, Jesus was helping James and John, as well as their mother, to learn something. What Jesus was helping James and John to learn is that being part of his kingdom, that involves a willingness to suffer. A willingness to drink from Jesus' cup, which is the cup of suffering. As a result, we have to ask ourselves, as Jesus asked James and John, are we able to drink that cup of suffering? Now, if we say, well, yeah, we're able, then we must have an awareness of what we're saying when we say we are able to drink of that cup of suffering. Because part of being a follower of Jesus is willing to suffer. Now, if all those things are in place, then the words of Jesus indicate that God the Father will give us a position in the kingdom of Jesus. What that position is, again, as Jesus has said, that's up to God the Father. Now, again, that's just some application of these verses to us. Any other questions or comments? Go ahead. Good. I had no idea till Shannon told us tonight that Matt had his surgery. So, Sandy, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Hmm. Okay. Okay. Well, Don, would you mind closing us in prayer and just include the things that were mentioned, if you could come up? So, all right.